The Long Beach Arena carried a different kind of energy that afternoon. Long before the final announcements were made and long before anyone imagined they would be talking about this event years later, the building was already full of anticipation. Nearly 3,000 people filled the seats from the floor level to the back wall, creating the steady hum that only exists when thousands of spectators gather around something they genuinely care about. The crowd was not there for a concert, a political speech, or a celebrity appearance. They were there for martial arts. They were there to watch elite competitors test themselves under bright lights in front of a knowledgeable audience that understood exactly what it was looking at. Every section of the arena reflected that shared purpose. Serious practitioners sat beside casual fans. Coaches leaned forward in their seats discussing techniques before matches even began. Former competitors pointed toward the floor while explaining details to friends and family members. The atmosphere was respectful, but it was also charged. Everyone understood that championship events often produce memorable moments. The only question was which athlete would create one. The competition floor sat at the center of it all, surrounded by rows of spectators whose attention rarely drifted away from the action. The lighting drew every eye toward the mat. From a distance, the competitors appeared almost larger than life. Every movement seemed important. Every introduction carried weight. The audience responded accordingly. Applause rolled through the arena whenever a respected name was mentioned. Conversations paused whenever an official stepped toward a microphone. Thousands of people had gathered for the same reason, and together they created an atmosphere where every detail felt significant. Among those in attendance was a man whose reputation had already become part of martial arts history. Sitting in the front row was Chuck Norris. He was easy to recognize, yet he was not drawing attention to himself. There was no dramatic entrance. No entourage surrounded him. No cameras followed his every movement. He simply occupied his seat near the competition area, dressed neatly and carrying himself with the quiet confidence that comes from decades of achievement. By that point, Chuck Norris was already known far beyond tournament circles. To some people, he was a former champion. To others, he was a movie star. Many in the audience viewed him as both. His competitive accomplishments had earned respect long before Hollywood made him famous. Years earlier, he had established himself as one of the most recognizable names in American karate. Even after stepping away from active competition, his presence still carried enormous weight. People did not need to be reminded who he was. When his name was announced, the reaction from the crowd reflected that reality. Applause swept across the arena almost immediately. It was not the reaction given to a newcomer or a temporary celebrity. It was the response reserved for someone who had earned lasting respect. The recognition came from people who knew exactly what he had accomplished. For a brief moment, thousands of spectators focused on the man sitting in the front row. Chuck acknowledged the applause with calm simplicity. He did not stand to celebrate. He did not wave dramatically. He did not attempt to become the center of attention. He simply accepted the recognition and returned his attention to the event. That reaction, quiet as it was, revealed something about him. While many people seek attention once they achieve fame, Chuck seemed entirely comfortable allowing the competition itself to remain the focus. Elsewhere in the arena, another figure was attracting attention for very different reasons. Dolph Lundgren was impossible to ignore. At 22 years old, he represented a completely different stage of life. Where Chuck embodied experience, Dolph represented youth. Where Chuck's reputation had been built over years of achievement, Dolph was still in the process of proving how far he could go. Physically, he stood out immediately. Tall, powerful, and athletic, he possessed the kind of presence that naturally drew eyes toward him. Even before a match began, spectators noticed him. He moved with the confidence of someone who fully believed in his abilities. There was no hesitation in the way he carried himself. No uncertainty appeared in his posture. Everything about him suggested ambition, strength, and momentum. His growing reputation had already crossed international borders. Competitors and coaches were aware of his accomplishments. Many had heard stories about his performances. Others had watched him compete directly. He arrived with credentials that demanded respect and with the physical tools to support them. For many people in attendance, he represented the next generation of elite martial artists. The contrast between the two men was impossible to miss. One sat quietly in the front row, his legacy already secure. The other stood near the center of the competitive spotlight, still climbing toward what he believed would be an even greater future. One had spent years proving himself against the best. The other appeared determined to show the world what he could become. As the tournament continued, the audience shifted its attention between the ongoing competition and the notable personalities present in the building. The crowd understood that they were watching more than just individual matches. They were witnessing a gathering of respected figures from different eras of martial arts. Veterans, champions, rising stars, coaches, and fans had all converged in one place. The arena itself seemed to reflect that meeting of generations. Experienced practitioners discussed the accomplishments of the past while younger competitors focused on the opportunities ahead. Established legends shared the same space as ambitious newcomers. The event became more than a tournament. It became a snapshot of martial arts at that moment in time. And at the center of that snapshot were two men who could hardly have appeared more different. Chuck Norris sat among 3,000 spectators carrying the calm presence of a man who had already achieved greatness. Dolph Lundgren moved through the event carrying the energy of someone convinced his greatest achievements still lay ahead. Around them, thousands of people watched, listened, and waited, unaware that the gathering itself was already creating the setting for a story that would remain unforgettable long after the lights inside the Long Beach arena went dark. By the time the heavyweight division reached its final stages, one competitor had become impossible for anyone in the building to ignore. It was not simply because he was winning. Athletes win tournaments every year. What separated Dolph Lundgren from everyone else that afternoon was the manner in which he was winning. There are moments in sports when a competitor appears to be operating at a level beyond the people around him. Every movement seems sharper. Every decision seems correct. Every challenge appears smaller than it should. That was the impression Dolph was creating as the day unfolded. At 22 years old, he possessed something that can only belong to youth. It was not merely strength. It was not merely speed. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that exists when success arrives repeatedly and recently enough that doubt no longer has room to enter the conversation. Dolph was not walking into matches wondering if he would win. He was walking into them expecting to win. There is a difference between confidence and expectation, and by that point in his career, he had crossed that line. His reputation had not appeared overnight. Years of disciplined training stood behind every performance. Long before most people in the arena had heard his name, he had already dedicated countless hours to developing himself as a martial artist. Training sessions, tournaments, victories, setbacks, and lessons had all contributed to the competitor standing on that floor. By the time he arrived in Long Beach, he was no longer a prospect. He was already recognized as one of the most dangerous young fighters in his discipline. His physical presence only reinforced that image. Standing 6 feet 5 inches tall and carrying over 200 pounds of athletic strength, he looked like someone built for confrontation. Even among other elite competitors, he stood out. Spectators naturally followed him with their eyes. Opponents noticed him before they ever stepped onto the mat. Coaches studied him carefully. He carried the kind of size that commands attention before a single technique is thrown. Yet physical attributes alone do not create reputations. Many large athletes never become champions. What impressed people was how effectively he used those gifts. His movements were disciplined rather than reckless. His power appeared controlled rather than wild. Every technique seemed connected to a clear purpose. He was not relying solely on strength. He was combining skill with strength, and that combination made him particularly difficult to deal with. As the tournament progressed, the evidence continued to accumulate. Match after match seemed to confirm what many people were beginning to suspect. Dolph was operating on a different level. Opponents entered with game plans and left unable to execute them. Techniques that worked against other competitors failed against him. Strategies dissolved under pressure. The deeper he advanced into the bracket, the stronger the perception became that he was the dominant force in the division. The crowd could feel it. Audiences often recognize momentum before statistics can explain it. There is a certain energy that develops around an athlete who appears unstoppable. Conversations begin to change. Spectators stop asking whether the athlete can win and start asking who might possibly stop them. That shift had already occurred. Dolph was no longer being viewed as simply another participant. He was becoming the story of the tournament. Part of that confidence came from his recent accomplishments outside the arena. Success tends to reinforce itself. Each victory strengthens belief. Each championship reinforces identity. A fighter who wins repeatedly begins to trust not only his abilities but also his assumptions about what will happen next. When enough positive outcomes accumulate, confidence can become something even stronger. It can become conviction. Dolph had reached that stage. He had spent years proving to himself that his approach worked. He had tested his skills against serious competition. He had experienced the pressure that breaks many athletes and emerged successful. Every achievement served as evidence supporting the same conclusion: he belonged among the best. For a young competitor, that realization can be incredibly powerful. But confidence has a hidden characteristic. When it continues growing without interruption, it can subtly change how a person views the world around them. Success begins to feel normal. Challenges appear smaller. Warnings become easier to dismiss. The mind naturally starts looking backward at victories rather than forward at potential risks. It is not arrogance in the traditional sense. It is often simply the result of repeated success teaching a person to expect more success. That mindset seemed visible in Dolph's demeanor throughout the event. He carried himself like someone who believed he had already solved the problems standing in front of him. There was no visible hesitation. No sign that he questioned his place among the elite. Every action suggested complete belief in his preparation and his abilities. To the audience, that confidence was compelling. Sports fans are naturally drawn toward dominant figures. They admire excellence. They enjoy watching athletes perform at extraordinary levels. Dolph gave them plenty of reasons to pay attention. Every strong performance strengthened his image. Every victory increased his momentum. Every successful moment added another layer to the growing perception that he was untouchable. And that perception extended beyond physical ability. He was young, healthy, ambitious, and ascending. From the outside, everything appeared to be moving in his favor. His future seemed wide open. Opportunities were multiplying. Success was arriving. The trajectory pointed upward in every visible way. Looking around the arena, it would have been difficult to identify many people who seemed positioned for a brighter future. Perhaps that is why his confidence felt so natural. He was not pretending to believe in himself. He genuinely did. From his perspective, the evidence was overwhelming. The training had worked. The victories were real. The reputation had been earned. The attention was justified. Every recent chapter of his life appeared to support the same conclusion. As spectators watched him move through the tournament environment, many saw the embodiment of youth at its most powerful. Strength, ambition, momentum, and certainty all existed in the same person. He looked like a man standing at the beginning of something extraordinary. More importantly, he looked like a man who knew it. In that arena filled with thousands of people, Dolph Lundgren carried himself as though the future already belonged to him. And based on everything the audience could see with their own eyes, it was difficult to argue otherwise. At that moment, surrounded by victories, fueled by confidence, and supported by a growing reputation, he appeared to be exactly what every young champion hopes to become, a competitor who believed there was nobody in the building he could not handle. The atmosphere inside the Long Beach arena changed in a way that was difficult to measure but impossible to miss. Only moments earlier, the audience had been reacting the way crowds normally react after a major competition. There was applause, conversation, movement in the aisles, and the familiar sense that an event was moving toward its conclusion. Then something happened that pulled every ounce of attention back toward the center of the floor. Dolph Lundgren remained where he was. Most champions follow a predictable routine after a victory. They acknowledge the officials, accept congratulations, pose for photographs, and eventually leave the competition area. The audience understands that rhythm because they have seen it countless times before. There is comfort in familiarity. People know what comes next. But that afternoon, Dolph did not appear interested in following the expected sequence. At first, only a few spectators noticed. Some assumed he was waiting for additional announcements. Others thought an official had given him instructions. Nothing seemed unusual enough to attract widespread attention. Yet as the seconds passed, more people began to realize that something was different. The conversations around the arena gradually faded. The movement in the aisles slowed. Heads turned toward the competition floor. There is a particular kind of silence that develops when thousands of people sense that an unscripted moment is about to unfold. Nobody announces it. Nobody requests it. The crowd simply feels it together. That feeling began spreading through the arena. Dolph stood confidently in the center of the floor, still carrying the energy that had followed him throughout the tournament. The victory had reinforced everything people already believed about him. He looked strong. He looked composed. Most importantly, he looked entirely certain of himself. When he reached for a microphone, the atmosphere shifted again. That single action immediately elevated the curiosity inside the building. Competitors did not normally address the crowd. Tournament winners were expected to celebrate their accomplishment, not deliver speeches. The moment the microphone came into view, thousands of people instinctively focused on what he might say. His first words did little to raise concern. He thanked the organizers. He acknowledged the opportunity to compete. He spoke respectfully about the event. The audience listened politely. Everything appeared normal. Then the tone began to change. Not dramatically at first. It happened gradually, almost subtly. His remarks started moving away from appreciation and toward comparison. He began discussing differences in training philosophies. Differences in approaches. Differences in what various competitors considered effective. The crowd listened carefully. Some spectators nodded. Others exchanged glances. People were no longer casually listening. They were analyzing. Dolph spoke with the confidence of someone who fully believed in his perspective. Every sentence seemed supported by the certainty that had fueled his rise. There was no hesitation in his delivery. No indication that he questioned the opinions he was expressing. As he continued, the audience sensed where the conversation might be heading. The reaction was immediate but restrained. A murmur spread through sections of the arena. Nothing hostile. Nothing explosive. Just thousands of people recognizing that the discussion was moving toward more dangerous territory. The reason was simple. Inside that building sat one of the most respected figures in martial arts. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew where he was sitting. And everyone knew his name. Chuck Norris occupied his front row seat with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the day. He had watched the competition quietly. He had accepted recognition without seeking attention. Nothing about his behavior suggested he wanted to become part of the story. Yet the direction of the conversation increasingly pointed toward him. The crowd felt it before it happened. People leaned forward. Arms folded across chests. Conversation stopped completely. The arena seemed to contract around a single moment. Then Dolph said his name. The effect was immediate. 3,000 people suddenly shared the same focus. Not because they were surprised to hear the name Chuck Norris. Everyone already knew he was present. What surprised them was the context. The attention shifted from the speaker to the front row. Spectators turned their heads. Photographers adjusted their positions. Even individuals who had only been half paying attention suddenly became fully engaged. Dolph continued speaking. His confidence never wavered. If anything, it became stronger. He spoke as a young champion who believed he had earned the right to challenge assumptions. He spoke as someone convinced that ability should be proven rather than celebrated. He spoke with the fearlessness that often accompanies youth, success, and momentum. And then the challenge became unmistakable. No one needed clarification. No one needed an explanation. The meaning landed instantly. What had started as a post-competition speech had transformed into a direct confrontation. Not physical. Not yet. But unquestionably personal. The audience reacted with the collective shock that only unscripted moments can create. Some people smiled in disbelief. Others stared silently. A few shook their heads. Many simply froze, trying to process what they had just heard. The reason the moment felt so powerful was not merely the challenge itself. Athletes challenge one another all the time. The reason it resonated was because of who was being challenged and where it was happening. This was not a private conversation. This was not a discussion behind closed doors. This was not a rumor spreading through gyms and training halls. This was happening in front of everyone. 3,000 witnesses. One microphone. One respected veteran. One rising champion. The contrast could not have been more dramatic. Dolph stood at the center of the spotlight, young and fearless. Chuck sat quietly in the front row, established and respected. For a brief moment, the entire arena seemed suspended between those two realities. The challenge itself carried an unmistakable message. It was the message of a man who believed he had reached a level where no reputation intimidated him. It was the message of someone convinced that greatness should be tested directly. Most of all, it was the message of someone who genuinely believed he could back up every word he was saying. That belief was what gave the moment its power. The crowd could hear it. They could see it. They could feel it. Dolph was not performing for attention. He appeared to mean every word. And because he appeared sincere, the challenge landed with even greater force. The arena fell into a tense silence. Not the silence of boredom. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of anticipation. Thousands of people waited. Some focused on the young champion holding the microphone. Others focused on the legendary figure seated in the front row. Nobody seemed interested in anything else. The tournament, the trophies, the announcements, the schedules, none of it mattered in that instant. Only the challenge mattered. Only the tension mattered. Only the question hanging in the air mattered. 3,000 people had arrived expecting to witness a martial arts event. Instead, they found themselves watching something far rarer. A young champion, overflowing with confidence and conviction, had publicly placed his reputation against the reputation of one of the most respected names in martial arts. And when the final words left the microphone, the entire arena waited to see what would happen next. The moment Dolph's challenge landed in the arena, the Long Beach crowd did not react in a simple, unified way. Instead, it fractured into layers of response that built on each other like pressure forming inside a sealed space. At first there was disbelief, the kind that makes people smile without realizing they are smiling. Then came silence, sharp and immediate, as the meaning fully registered. And after that, something far more powerful began to take shape, anticipation mixed with uncertainty. 3,000 people were now locked into the same moment, but they were not thinking the same thing. Some were excited, sensing history. Others were uneasy, aware that something unpredictable had just been set in motion. A few leaned toward skepticism, wondering if what they had just heard was even real or exaggerated by adrenaline in the room. But none of them looked away. Every eye stayed fixed on the center of the arena, waiting for the response that would define everything. The microphone still echoed faintly in the speakers as Dolph lowered his arm. He did not step back. He did not retreat. He remained exactly where he was, standing tall, as if he had simply stated a fact rather than issued a challenge. That calm posture only deepened the tension. Confidence without movement has a strange effect on a crowd. It removes excuses. It removes ambiguity. It forces the audience to accept that the moment is real. Then the entire arena shifted its attention, not toward the speaker, but toward the front row. Because everyone knew who was sitting there. Chuck Norris had not reacted immediately. That alone created a new layer of tension. In most public confrontations, reactions come quickly. A smile, a shake of the head, a laugh, a refusal, or even visible irritation. But there was nothing immediate from him. He remained seated, composed, almost motionless. That stillness was not empty, it was heavy. It made the air around him feel tighter, as if the space itself had become more serious. People in nearby rows began to notice subtle changes in posture. Some spectators who had been relaxed earlier now sat upright. Others stopped whispering entirely. Even those who had been distracted seconds before now found themselves fully locked into the scene unfolding in front of them. The crowd's attention was no longer scattered. It was converging. A few seconds passed like that, which in a large arena feels much longer than it should. Time begins to stretch when anticipation replaces action. Every moment becomes magnified. The smallest gesture feels significant. The absence of movement feels even more significant. Then Chuck finally shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was controlled. He turned his head slightly toward the center of the floor, just enough for people to notice that he was acknowledging what had been said. That small movement alone changed the energy again. The crowd sensed it instantly. This was no longer a one-sided challenge floating in the air. It had been received. A ripple moved through the audience. Not noise, not yet, but awareness. The kind of awareness that travels faster than sound. People leaned forward again, as if the physical act of leaning could help them understand what was about to happen. Cameras adjusted. Officials paused their conversations. Even the competitors waiting off to the side of the mat became still. Chuck did not stand immediately. That decision carried its own weight. It suggested control, patience, and awareness of timing. In a setting where most people respond emotionally, hesitation from a figure like him created a different kind of pressure. It forced the audience to wait on his terms rather than their own. Dolph remained standing in the center of the floor, watching the front row. His expression did not change. He had issued the challenge and now appeared ready for whatever response followed. There was no sign of doubt in him. But even confidence can exist alongside tension, and that tension was now visible in the space between the two men, even though they were not yet physically facing each other. The audience began to feel that space more intensely than anything else in the arena. It was no longer about the tournament. It was no longer about rankings or titles. The entire room had narrowed into a single relationship, the challenger and the man being challenged. A few spectators began to whisper, but even those whispers felt out of place and quickly faded. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. The silence returned, but it was not peaceful silence. It was charged silence. The kind that builds right before a decisive moment. Chuck finally leaned forward slightly. That movement changed everything again. It was minimal, but in that environment, minimal was enough. People interpreted it instantly. He was preparing to respond, not verbally through the crowd, but physically through action or acknowledgement. The anticipation in the arena intensified sharply. Some spectators instinctively held their breath without realizing it. The tension was now layered so thickly that even small sounds became noticeable. A chair shifting. A foot adjusting on the floor. A camera shutter clicking. Each sound felt amplified in contrast to the silence surrounding it. Dolph's stance remained unchanged, but the energy in the room around him began to shift. He was still the center of attention, but no longer the only focal point. The front row had become equally important. The interaction between the two sides of the arena was now the story itself. Then Chuck stood. The movement was controlled, deliberate, and unmistakable. The effect on the crowd was immediate and physical. A wave of reaction moved through the arena, not as cheering, not as shouting, but as a collective intake of breath followed by sudden stillness. It was the kind of reaction that happens when a moment finally crosses from possibility into reality. Every person in the building understood that something irreversible had just taken shape. Chuck Norris did not rush. He did not gesture. He did not speak. He simply rose from his seat and faced forward, acknowledging the challenge without theatrics. That simplicity carried more weight than any dramatic reaction could have. It suggested certainty rather than emotion. The audience felt that certainty instantly. And that is when the tension reached its peak. Because now there was no ambiguity left. The challenge had been made. It had been received. And it had been answered with presence rather than words. 3,000 people sat frozen between anticipation and disbelief, realizing that what had begun as a speech was no longer a speech at all. It had become a confrontation unfolding in real time, and every second from that point forward was going to matter more than the last. The atmosphere inside the Long Beach arena tightened the moment Chuck Norris stepped away from his seat. It was not loud. In fact, it was the absence of noise that made it feel so intense. 3,000 people were watching a situation that no longer belonged to the structure of a tournament. This was no longer about brackets, scores, or championships. Something unscheduled had taken control of the entire space, and everyone in the building understood it. Chuck moved with steady calm as he crossed the narrow space between the front row and the edge of the competition floor. There was no rush in his steps. No hesitation either. Each movement felt deliberate, as if he had already decided exactly how the next moments would unfold. That quiet control changed the emotional temperature of the arena. When a crowd sees urgency, it reacts with noise. When it sees certainty, it becomes silent. Dolph Lundgren remained where he was, standing in the center of the mat. He did not shift his stance or adjust his posture. He simply watched as the distance between them disappeared. His confidence had not faded, but it was now meeting something it had not encountered earlier in the day. Not resistance, not aggression, but calm presence. The kind of presence that does not need to announce itself to be understood. Officials near the edge of the mat instinctively stepped aside without being told. There was no protocol written for this kind of moment. Tournaments are structured for competition, not confrontation between generations of champions. Yet the space cleared itself naturally, as if the environment recognized the need for separation. Cameras tilted. Judges paused. Even the announcer remained silent. Chuck reached the edge of the competition area and stopped. For a brief moment, nothing happened. That pause was not empty. It was heavy with meaning. In that stillness, both men were fully visible to the entire arena. One standing in the center of his victory. The other standing at the boundary of his legacy. The distance between them was small in physical terms, but enormous in emotional weight. Chuck slowly removed his sport coat. The motion was unhurried, almost casual, yet it drew complete attention. Every spectator in the building focused on that single action. The coat came off cleanly, folded once with precision, and handed to a nearby official without ceremony. There was no attempt to perform. No attempt to impress. The simplicity of the action made it more powerful. Dolph's eyes followed every movement. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He observed. The confidence he carried earlier in the evening was still present, but now it existed alongside awareness. Not doubt, but recognition that what was unfolding was not ordinary. Chuck stepped closer to the mat. He removed his shoes next. Each shoe was placed carefully to the side, not thrown, not dropped. The act felt almost ritualistic, as if separating himself from the outside world before stepping into something that required complete presence. When he stepped onto the mat barefoot, the contrast became clear. One man was already inside the arena, shaped by competition. The other had just entered it, bringing with him something that did not belong to the structure of the event. The crowd reacted without sound. No cheering. No shouting. Just a collective tightening of attention. People leaned forward in their seats again, drawn in by the gravity of what they were witnessing. Dolph adjusted his position slightly for the first time since the challenge began. A subtle shift of weight. A recalibration. He was now facing the man directly, no longer addressing the idea of him from across the arena, but standing in front of him in real space. The psychological distance had collapsed. The announcer finally moved toward the microphone, as if remembering his role in the structure of the event. His voice broke the silence carefully, almost cautiously, introducing what was about to happen as an unscheduled exhibition. The words felt inadequate for the situation, but they were the only structure available. The arena absorbed them, but the meaning of the moment was already beyond formal explanation. When the word "fight" was spoken, something subtle changed in the air. It was not chaos. It was focus. Dolph moved first. His entry was immediate, direct, and aggressive in structure, the kind of forward pressure that had carried him through the tournament. He closed distance with intent, bringing forward the kind of attack that had overwhelmed previous opponents. It was decisive, built on momentum and physical dominance. But the moment he advanced, the expected outcome did not occur. Chuck was no longer in the place where he had been standing. The movement was small but precise. A shift off the center line. Not backward. Not defensive in appearance. Simply repositioned. The attack passed through empty space where contact had been expected. The crowd registered it instantly, not as a missed strike, but as something else entirely. A disruption of expectation. Dolph continued forward, recalibrating immediately. Another technique followed, then another, each building on the last. The rhythm of his offense increased, but something fundamental had changed. The space he needed to land cleanly was no longer stable. Every time he closed distance, the target was no longer where he expected it to be. Chuck did not respond with visible force. There was no dramatic counterattack. No explosive retaliation. Instead, there was control of positioning. Small adjustments. Subtle changes in timing. Enough to redirect momentum without meeting it directly. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like avoidance. To those who understood movement at this level, it was something far more significant. It was management of space itself. Not fighting strength with strength, but refusing to be present in the place where strength was meant to land. Dolph pressed harder. The confidence that had defined him earlier in the evening was still there, but now it had a different tone. It was no longer effortless. It was being tested. Each new attempt required more intention than the last. The clean rhythm of dominance he had carried through earlier matches was no longer functioning in the same way. The crowd sensed the shift before they could explain it. At first there had been anticipation. Then silence. Now there was focus so intense that even blinking felt like a distraction. People were no longer reacting to individual techniques. They were watching the relationship between intention and response. Dolph launched another committed sequence, faster than before, sharper, more determined. It was the kind of combination that had ended fights earlier in the day. But again, the expected result did not come. The space collapsed without contact. The pressure failed to land where it was aimed. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty appeared in the rhythm of the exchange. Not fear. Not panic. Just a disruption in certainty. Chuck remained composed. No wasted movement. No visible strain. He was not matching energy. He was redirecting it by not meeting it at all. The arena, now fully absorbed in what it was witnessing, had reached a state where sound no longer mattered. Every adjustment, every shift, every missed connection carried more weight than any reaction from the crowd could add. And as the confrontation continued to unfold in that controlled, tightening space, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about who was stronger in the traditional sense. It was about something far more subtle, and far more decisive, beginning to reveal itself in real time. The rhythm of the confrontation had been building in controlled silence, but there comes a moment in every high-pressure exchange when the entire meaning of what is happening suddenly shifts. It does not arrive with warning. It does not announce itself. It simply happens, and when it does, everyone watching feels it at the same time. That moment came when Dolph Lundgren committed fully to an attack that, by every expectation built earlier in the day, should have worked. He stepped in with decisive force, closing distance with the kind of aggression that had ended every previous match in his favor. His movement was not careless. It was trained, repeated, and refined through countless repetitions. The crowd recognized it instantly. This was the pattern they had already seen succeed. The kind of entry that breaks timing. The kind of pressure that forces opponents to react too late. But what happened next did not match what the arena had been conditioned to expect. Chuck Norris was not where he was supposed to be. There was no dramatic counterstrike. No visible struggle. No collision of force. Instead, there was a simple absence of target at the exact moment contact was expected. Dolph's attack passed through space that had just been occupied, and for a fraction of a second, there was nothing to connect to. The crowd did not react immediately. Large audiences process shock in layers. First comes confusion, then recognition, then adjustment. That delay created a strange quiet that felt heavier than noise. People leaned forward without realizing it. Eyes narrowed. Focus sharpened. Something had been missed, but nobody was yet sure what it was. Dolph turned and pressed again. His confidence did not disappear. It adapted. This is what separates elite competitors from ordinary ones. When a technique fails, they do not stop. They adjust immediately and reapply pressure. He advanced again with a different angle, trying to reclaim the initiative. His movements were still strong, still precise, still grounded in years of training. But again, the expected connection did not happen. Chuck's position shifted at the exact moment it needed to. Not early enough to look like avoidance. Not late enough to take damage. It existed in a narrow window that most spectators could not consciously register. To them, it simply looked like nothing was landing. But to those who understood timing, it was something far more specific. It was control over the moment before impact. The arena began to change emotionally. At first, the audience had been excited. A public challenge between two respected figures naturally produces anticipation. Then it became tense, as the confrontation began. But now, something deeper was forming. The excitement was being replaced by analysis. The crowd was no longer reacting emotionally. They were trying to understand what they were seeing. Dolph increased pressure. He moved faster, more aggressively, reducing hesitation. The kind of tempo he created earlier in the tournament returned, but now it carried a different feeling. It was no longer effortless dominance. It was determined pursuit. Every movement suggested that he was trying to force resolution before uncertainty could grow. But uncertainty was already growing. Not in his technique. In the environment around him. The space between the two men no longer felt predictable. Every time Dolph closed distance, the outcome failed to align with expectation. That mismatch between intention and result is what begins to unsettle even the most confident competitors. Not because they suddenly doubt their ability, but because the feedback loop they rely on stops functioning correctly. The audience felt this shift before they could articulate it. A fighter lands a technique, and the crowd understands it. A fighter misses, and the crowd understands that too. But when a sequence repeatedly produces no clear result, perception begins to fracture. People start questioning what they are actually seeing. Dolph launched another sequence, sharper and more committed than before. The movement carried conviction. It was not hesitation. It was escalation. He was trying to break through a pattern that was no longer responding in a predictable way. And again, nothing clean connected. This time, however, something changed in how the moment felt. Earlier misses could be dismissed individually. A timing issue. A slight adjustment. A narrow evasion. But repetition removes randomness from interpretation. When the same result happens multiple times in different ways, the mind begins to search for structure instead of chance. That is when perception shifts. For the first time, the audience was no longer focused on Dolph's offense alone. Their attention split between action and response. Between intention and outcome. Between what was being thrown and what was refusing to be hit. And in that space, Chuck Norris stopped appearing as simply a passive participant. He became the reference point. Not because he was striking. Not because he was overwhelming. But because everything around him was failing to land. The turning point was subtle, but absolute. A moment arrived where Dolph launched a committed attack that carried visible weight and intent. The kind of movement that, under normal conditions, produces a decisive reaction. The crowd anticipated impact. They expected either a clean connection or a visible defensive struggle. Instead, there was once again only absence. But this time, the absence was not processed as missed. It was processed as controlled. That is the moment everything changed. Because a missed attack suggests failure from the attacker. But controlled absence suggests influence from the defender. And once the audience unconsciously accepted that interpretation, the entire structure of the confrontation shifted in their minds. People began to lean forward even further, not in excitement, but in realization. Officials at the edge of the mat stopped shifting their weight. They stood completely still. Even Dolph's rhythm changed slightly. Not visibly broken, but subtly recalibrated. The certainty that had carried him through earlier exchanges was now interacting with something it had not fully accounted for. Chuck remained calm. Still minimal movement. Still no visible strain. But now, his positioning was no longer being interpreted as avoidance. It was being interpreted as control over timing itself. The difference is small in description, but massive in perception. Avoidance implies reaction. Control implies authority. And that is what the audience began to see. For the first time since the confrontation began, the crowd was no longer watching a young champion trying to impose dominance on a veteran figure. They were watching something that felt more one-sided in a different direction than anyone had anticipated. Not through aggression. Not through force. But through the consistent failure of offense to find its target. The emotional temperature of the arena shifted again. Earlier it had been anticipation. Then tension. Now it was recognition. People were beginning to understand that what they were witnessing did not fit the normal language of competition. Something deeper was unfolding, something that could not be explained by strength or speed alone. Dolph pressed once more, but the urgency in his movement had changed. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. The confidence was still there, yet it now had to coexist with the reality of repeated non-contact. And in that coexistence, perception fully shifted. The crowd was no longer waiting to see who would land a decisive strike. They were beginning to realize that the outcome of this encounter might already be forming in a way that had nothing to do with impact at all. And once that realization settled across the arena, everything about the confrontation felt different. When the final seconds of the confrontation settled into silence, the Long Beach arena did not immediately return to normal. Events like that do not end in a clean emotional break. The body may stop moving, the action may pause, but the meaning continues to echo long after the physical moment is over. 3,000 people remained seated for a few seconds longer than expected, as if no one was entirely sure whether the moment had actually concluded or was still unfolding in some deeper way. There was no sudden celebration. No eruption of noise. No immediate shift back into routine tournament behavior. Instead, there was a shared stillness that felt more like reflection than reaction. People were not looking for the next match. They were replaying what they had just witnessed, trying to understand it in full. In large crowds, that kind of silence is rare. It only appears when something has interrupted expectation so completely that the audience needs time to catch up with its own perception. On the floor, both men remained composed. There was no visible frustration, no anger, no theatrics. What had taken place between them did not produce the kind of emotional release that audiences are used to seeing after competition. There was no clear winner declared in the traditional sense, no decisive collapse, no dramatic finish that allowed the crowd to categorize the outcome in simple terms. Instead, what remained was ambiguity shaped by control, timing, and restraint. That ambiguity is what made the moment linger. Eventually, movement returned to the arena in fragments. Officials stepped forward cautiously. Spectators began to shift in their seats. Small conversations restarted in low tones, as people tried to confirm with each other what they had just seen. But even as the physical environment resumed activity, the psychological weight of the moment had not lifted. Something had changed in the way the crowd understood competition itself. For many in attendance, the immediate question was not who won, but what they had actually witnessed. That distinction is important. In most sporting events, the outcome defines the memory. Here, the memory was defining the outcome. People struggled to fit what they saw into familiar categories. It did not resemble a typical victory. It did not resemble a typical defeat. It existed in a space that required interpretation rather than conclusion. Chuck Norris left the mat without any visible display of emotion. There was no attempt to draw attention to himself, no effort to frame the moment publicly, no need to turn it into a performance beyond what had already occurred. He moved with the same quiet control that had characterized his presence from the beginning. That consistency became part of what the audience remembered most clearly. In a situation where intensity could have justified exaggeration, restraint stood out even more. Dolph Lundgren also exited without spectacle. His departure carried a different tone, shaped less by presentation and more by reflection. There was no immediate attempt to explain or redefine what had happened. Instead, there was a sense of internal processing, as if the significance of the moment would take time to fully settle. In the hours that followed, the arena itself began to empty, but the conversation did not end. It simply moved outside its walls. People discussed it in parking lots, in small groups, on long drives home, trying to articulate what had felt different about that encounter. Some described it in technical terms, focusing on movement and timing. Others spoke in broader language, emphasizing presence, control, and composure. But across all versions of the conversation, one idea kept returning in different forms, the sense that they had witnessed something that did not behave like ordinary competition. Over time, that shared memory began to shape its own narrative. Not immediately, and not uniformly, but gradually. Stories like this rarely remain fixed in their original form. They evolve as they are retold, not because people intend to distort them, but because human memory naturally emphasizes meaning over detail. What remains consistent is not always the exact sequence of actions, but the impression those actions leave behind. Within martial arts communities, the account of that encounter began to take on a deeper significance. It was no longer discussed as just another exhibition or a unique public moment. It became an example referenced in discussions about timing, awareness, and composure under pressure. Coaches used it as a point of reflection. Practitioners analyzed it from different angles. Not to reconstruct it exactly, but to understand the principles it seemed to reveal. The most enduring lesson drawn from that afternoon was not about physical dominance. It was not about size, speed, or strength in isolation. It was about perception under pressure. About how expectations can shape interpretation. About how control is not always expressed through force, but sometimes through the ability to remain unaffected by it. That idea resonated far beyond the arena. For younger practitioners, the story became something to aspire to understand rather than simply admire. For experienced competitors, it became a reminder that skill is not only measured in execution, but also in awareness. And for those who had been present in the arena itself, it remained a personal reference point, a moment they would return to mentally whenever discussions of true mastery arose. In the years that followed, both men continued their lives in very different directions, yet the memory of that shared moment remained attached to their names. It became part of how people described their legacies, not as the defining achievement of either career, but as a point where their paths intersected in a way that revealed something deeper about both. What endured most was not a statistic or a scorecard. It was the feeling of having witnessed a moment where expectations broke apart and were replaced by something harder to define. A moment where a crowd of thousands collectively realized that what they thought they were watching was not the same thing as what was actually unfolding in front of them. Long after the arena emptied and the lights were turned off, that realization remained. It continued to exist in memory, in conversation, and in reflection. And in that sense, the encounter did not end when the participants left the mat. It continued as part of how it reshaped understanding, becoming less a story about confrontation and more a story about perception, discipline, and the quiet authority of control that does not need to announce itself in order to be felt.